Hi, I'm Karin Zissis with ASCOA Online. Ever since he came to power 11 years ago, Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro has been stacking the decks in his political favor. But will he hit a wall in the July 28th election? Polls give opposition candidate Edmundo González Urrutia a big advantage over Maduro. It's doubtful the Maduro regime will allow for free and fair elections. On that front, it's already showed its hand, disqualifying Maria Corina Machado from running in March, even though she won the opposition primary by 87%. But the opposition has largely united behind Machado and her replacement, the seasoned diplomat González.
While Chavismo knows how to do tricks and electoral engineering to modify votes in certain centers, this tends to happen only when the gap between Chavismo and the opposition is really tight, not when it's this big.
That's Tony Frangie Mawad, Caracas-based journalist and political analyst. An editor at Caracas Chronicles, he's written for Bloomberg, The Economist, Politico, and even our own America's Quarterly. In this episode, he explains what's at stake for the Venezuelan regime.
I mean, they could try to do a mega fraud, but the political cost, even within the ruling coalition, could be very high.
Frangie told my colleague and head of ASCOA's Venezuela Working Group, Guillermo Zubillaga, what's shifting in Venezuela's current scenario, from a grassroots opposition mobilization to a fresh political narrative of empowerment to a more engaged youth vote.
Many young people are actually mobilizing and joining organizations, trying to do something to help, because for young people in Venezuela, a change in the political system means a massive change in their future.
Venezuelans' participation is evident not only on the streets, but on social media. In a country with high levels of press censorship, voters are turning to social media for news and to get organized. 71% of Venezuelans get their news from social and online platforms, while only 23% use traditional media. That's not lost in Maduro's political calculus.
We have documented how the Maduro government has been using tactics very similar as the other authoritarian countries in the region uses. They pay for people to tweet in favor of them.
That's Mariví Marín Vázquez, a Venezuelan political communication strategist and CEO and founder of Probox. This digital observatory monitors online conversations and spotlights misinformation in countries such as Venezuela, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Marin told me how Maduro is trying to soften his image online.
TikTok has become this new platform to have access and to have popularity. The Maduro regime has been increasing the operations in this platform. Somehow, they are achieving to skip the TikTok algorithm that basically doesn't want the political content to be on the most important content on the platform.
But first, we'll hear from Frangie about the mood on the ground in Venezuela. Thank you for being with us. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Latin American Focus at Apple, Spotify, or your platform of choice. We hope you enjoy this episode.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Tony, for someone who follows the conversation, but maybe not as closely, give us a little bit overview of the situation right now.
Sure thing. So, according to our constitution, we must have presidential elections this year in Venezuela. And the government decided to hold them on July 28th, which is not the typical electoral season in the country. The opposition, for the first time since 2013, is jointly participating with a single candidate against Nicolás Maduro. They also organize primaries in which they somehow legitimize the new leader of the opposition, who is Maria Corina Machado, a former lawmaker from Caracas. And these primaries, which many expected to be a sort of failure, ended up mobilizing huge chunks of the population and somehow brought politics back to the conversation in Venezuela and brought the expectation of change through the electoral way. But Maria Corina Machado was then banned from running for office by the judicial system here in Venezuela, which is also controlled by Chavismo.
Right.
And somehow the government thought that this would turn the opposition into infighting. But the opposition managed, through a very complex process, to have a sort of proxy candidate who is Edmundo González Urrutia, a former diplomat who was very little known before he became suddenly the leading candidate according to polls. And that's an important part of what's happening. With Machado's endorsement, González Urrutia now has a lead over Maduro of around 20 points on the polls, which could signify a landslide victory for the opposition. While Chavismo knows how to do tricks and electoral engineering to modify votes in certain centers, this tends to happen only when the gap between Chavismo and the opposition is really tight, not when it's this big. And this could force Chavismo to a very tense situation in which they could be forced to recognize a sort of transition or recognize at least the electoral victory of the opposition, as they did with the parliamentary elections of 2015, in which the opposition won by a landslide. I mean, they could try to do a mega fraud, but the political cost, even within the ruling coalition, could be very high. While a large gap is important, there are also other elements in play. So, first of all, the opposition has managed to create a very large network of volunteers, activists, and polling station witnesses to
Got it.
protect the vote on July 28th. And the opposition says they already covered 99% of all the voting centers. So the opposition is organizing people to protect the integrity of the vote on July 28th. You also have a united and coordinated coalition despite years of oppositional infighting. And you also have the element of both extreme dissatisfaction within the Chavista population and a rejection of the typical control methods that Chavismo tends to use, for example, food bags or politically motivated benefits. They're no longer controlling people. There's a big rejection because they're not really benefiting anyone anymore.
But speaking about mobilization, it seems to me that the campaign of Maria Corina and Edmundo have really mobilized people. Can you take, I mean, I know it's hard describing this really emotional images, but can you maybe share, I know that you've traveled with the campaign, but can you share something that could help the listener understand?
Yeah, Venezuelans started to mobilize since last year during the campaign for the primaries when the opposition visited around 270 municipalities out of the 335 we have here. And then that became like a tsunami of human mobilization as Machado started to rally up the country and visited actually most of it. So what we're seeing is a sort of direct emotional connection between Maria Corina Machado and citizens in Venezuela, similar to actually what used to happen with Hugo Chavez
Right.
during his peak. Machado, in a way, symbolizes the Venezuelan mother in a culture that anthropologists describe as matricentral. Through that figure, she also represents the idea that you can take a hold your destiny and your own income in your house, and you no longer depend on these communal structures that are controlling people since the last 10 years. And that's because, in a way, she represents this working mother that we tend to see a lot in Venezuela. So when people see her, they start to cry a lot, or they try to touch her. It's a very messianic thing, cathartic thing, in which they ask her for the return of their family, because this is also a very psychosocial phenomenon in which Venezuelans are emotionally damaged and ravaged by the destruction of the family after 25% of the country left. So most Venezuelan families, the big majority of them, have relatives abroad. And that idea of a broken family, of Maria Corina Machado promising the return of the relatives and the reunification of the Venezuelan family, is driving these emotional outbursts of the people when they see her. They're always, for example, handling her rosaries all the time, to the point in which Maria Corina literally has hundreds of rosaries she has received throughout the country from the people, which are very symbolic. They give them to her as a sort of gift of gratefulness, but also as a sort of protection to go with her wherever she goes.
Wow. And you were with her in one of her meetings recently, right?
Yeah, during the rallies, I'm very surprised, first of all, by the diversity of the people there. There's a lot of different profiles of all sorts of Venezuelans of different social classes, races, etc. But there are a lot of profiles that tend to appear a lot in these rallies. For example, people who receive pensions, like people who retire and they're receiving, $3 a month by the state.
Right.
College professors who are also receiving nothing. They have some of the worst salaries in the country. And actually, public sector teachers have been leading protests for the last 2 years. So it's very interesting to see how a labor movement suddenly connected with a political movement. For example, yesterday, Machado went to the Central University in Caracas, and she told the people, the youth, I love this message. She told them, "You were born and raised in tyranny, but you will now celebrate in freedom."
Wow.
She's talking to a generation that hasn't even lived democracy, which includes
Of
me. I was
course.
born in 1997. And that's amazing. But I think that what actually shocked me the most was when I managed to get on the truck with Edmundo and Maria Corina in Caracas, and
Hmm.
I could get a panoramic view of the rally in the capital city, which is, the most well off, which
Yeah,
is, it hasn't seen this sort of discontent as much as the rest
of
of the
course,
country.
right.
Then I saw this and I said, wow, even Caracas is mobilized. I swear I couldn't see where the rally began and where it ended. It was just a very, very long carpet of human heads with banners and screaming and crying, and it was very, very impressive.
Is your generation, Tony, willing to vote, or do you sense like is the youth also really eager to participate?
I think there's a part of the youth that seems to be cynical or very careless about this because they've never seen anything different.
Right.
But many young people are actually mobilizing and joining organizations. I'm not sure if the majority, but many of them are actually
Right.
trying to do something to help, because for young people in Venezuela, a change in the political system means a massive change in their future. We're talking about a country that has barely no credit, so you will never buy a house or a car or have a family
Yeah.
with such low salaries, and where there's no freedom of expression or of political affiliation.
Tony, you talked about migration, or we're in the middle of, of a U.S. election where migration is a huge topic. A lot of that migration in recent years has been Venezuelan migrants. So I just want to get a sense for our listener what could happen in the event of a non-political transition materializing and staying within the status quo.
So Delphos, one of our local pollsters here, like 2 months ago, I was talking with its director, Felix Seijas, and he was telling
Yes.
me that around 20% of Venezuelans say they're thinking of moving out of the country. And of that 20%, 60% says they will decide based on the result of the elections and if Maduro
Wow.
wins again. Many specialists and analysts here think that if Maduro wins, it will probably lead to another wave of massive migration, because when you see Venezuela's economy in the last years and you see it's growing 9% or 4%, that would be huge for a normal country. But Venezuela had a economic contraction that practically has no historical precedent anywhere, not even in war-torn countries.
Of course.
So if Maduro wins again and we get the same legal framework we have here and the same institutions and the same lack of foreign investment, the same lack of funds, what we're going to continue having is a stagnated economy in the basement with a lot of exclusion, a lot of inequality, which will simply result in more and more migrants getting out of Venezuela with or without sanctions.
Tony, I feel like one big player, if we see that massive mobilization happening on the 28th of July, one key witness and key player is going to be the military. I know that's
Yeah,
a black box, it's really hard to say, but
it is.
what are your thoughts about them, about how they could react, etc.?
Well, Guillermo, as you said, the armed forces is a sort of black box in Venezuela. They don't really speak the same language as civil society. I do believe that those who tend to think what they're gonna do, either a pro-Chavista vision or a pro-opposition vision, don't really know what they might do, because they're very different even from Chavismo itself, and that's an important element to consider. The armed force in Venezuela, they have historically have like their own sort of institutional culture and even rights. And one of the things that has defined the armed forces, they tend to support the commander in chief, the president, based on a sort of electoral legitimacy.
Got it.
If the president doesn't have that electoral legitimacy, there's no guarantee that the armed force will recognize and make a fraud, for example, or will recognize a hijacked election. That's not a given, not necessarily. So we don't know what they might do. The armed forces has surprised us before, even in, as I said, the 2015 elections with the same actual defense minister we have now. And we don't know what they might do. In the end, I think that who might actually end up defining the situation post 28 could be the judicial system. What I'm always saying is that July 28th, if Maduro wins the election, or if Edmundo wins the election, it's going to be just the beginning of a new chapter. It's not going to be the end of this story.
Right.
And we might see, for example, the judicial power trying to take powers away from the presidency, or the Chavista controlled current assembly we have trying to block the presidency, at least for a year, because we have parliamentary elections next year. So I wouldn't be surprised if the government recognizes the opposition's victory, and we end up having a Guatemala-like situation in which the president faces
Right.
institutions controlled by its adversaries. Nevertheless, a president has more legitimacy than an assembly, so
Of
it might
course.
actually usher a set of events that could, lead to a transition in Venezuela.
That is an interesting scenario, and I had thought about it, but I hadn't like played it out like you did. So, Tony, and then let's talk about, I guess, the scenario of the massive fraud, right? I mean, saying like, if the polls are within this margin of 20%, and
Mm-hmm.
Maduro has to use massive fraud. Do you anticipate people coming out in the streets? Do you anticipate there would be a repression wave? Like, how
Okay.
would that play out in your view?
So I always say that predicting Venezuela is extremely difficult because
Of
it's like
course.
a Tetris game, which all these pieces, moving at the same time. And first of all, we have to consider that when Chavismo has done elections with big numbers that are actually doubtful, for example, the elections for the Constituent Assembly in
Right.
2017 or the Essequibo referendum in December of last year, these are elections in which the opposition has no witnesses. You can do whatever you want with the numbers in a way.
Of course.
In other cases, for example, the regional elections of 2017, when Andrés Velázquez won the governorship of the state of Bolívar, and the government ended up getting control of it, and
Yes.
Velázquez said it was a fraud. Practically, the irregularities happened in three remote rural centers. So it was again, the very small gap in which you can play with the results
Got
on a very few neuralgic centers, as they call them here. So in this case, as I said, a knockout victory of the opposition would be crucial to avoid that. So the government in that scenario would be forced to do a sort of mega fraud like Ferdinand Marcos in 1986 in the Philippines. First of all, how would the opposition react? Would they call to protest on that night, or
Right.
they wouldn't? With people with their emotions high, they could go to the streets. And how would the army react, considering, for example, the investigation of the International Criminal Court on crimes against humanity? I don't think we've seen a scenario like this before. As I mentioned, the cases in which we had seen very big numbers that are doubtful are cases in which the opposition hasn't participated. And when it has, and we have doubted on the results, it's usually on small gaps, on small margins between the two candidates.
That's
If
a
the
really
gap
interesting
is too
point.
big, it could be like a very, on the limit situation.
Parting thoughts. Our listeners, right, they pay a lot of attention to Latin America. That's where they're
Mhm.
listening to this. The elections are on the 28th. What
Yeah.
are you looking for, and what should we be looking for?
Wow, that's a big question. I think we should just keep our eyes on the campaign and see if the judicial system ends up doing any move against the opposition 2 weeks before the elections.
Meaning like
And
banning it,
definitely
or
on, yeah, ban Edmundo González Urrutia on the last minute or eliminate the opposition parties from the ballot. But nevertheless, I think we should also keep our eye on civil society and its mobilization efforts
okay.
and how people will vote, because I feel that the real protagonists and the real heroes of whatever happens in Venezuela are going to be the Venezuelan people. As cliche and cheesy as it sounds, despite 25 years of, democratic backsliding, Venezuelans have been resilient and have kept on defending the democratic values we used to have before the revolution.
Again, let's just remind people where they can find you, your newsletter, your podcast.
Sure. You can find my newsletter on Substack. It's Venezuela Weekly. It's also on my link on every social media account I have. My podcast, it's on YouTube and Spotify. It's called Venezuela Weekly, just like my newsletter.
Excellent. Tony, thank you so much.
Both candidates have embraced social media to capture voters' interest. And a ProBox investigation found that even though Maduro claims social media platforms are censoring him, the regime has orchestrated hashtag campaigns like Nico Like and Yo Sigo a Maduro to generate tens of thousands of posts backing him. Maria Marin, CEO and founder of ProBox, tells us how the regime exploits social media, even as online tools offer an opportunity for independent news sources and civil society to share information.
No importa mi amor, lo juro, nos volveremos a encontrar.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Mariví. Just to start off, let's lay the scene a little bit because challenges of Venezuelan disinformation are nothing new. I mean, there have been years of media censorship. Given ProBox's research, what are some of the major issues you're seeing in terms of disinformation in this current electoral round? Is there something different?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. And as you mentioned, censorship in Venezuela has been an ongoing issue for years that has been increasing during electoral periods, especially. And nowadays, with the presidential election, we are seeing robust efforts from the Venezuelan regime to increase all of these tactics, not only censorship, but also propaganda, disinformation campaigns against the opposition leaders, even against journalists and activists that are working in Venezuela. But the things that has changed for worse also is that the investigators doesn't have the same resources to study and to analyze the digital conversation, the social media conversations, as we used to have. Since Elon Musk bought Twitter, many things has changed, not only the name, but also things like the API access that was the access that researchers used to have to analyze disinformation, coordinated campaigns in social media. But not only Twitter has decreased in the access to their data, it's also Meta and TikTok. They don't have API access free for journalists or universities. It's very limited. The people or even the investigators that can access through the APIs.
One of the things that we've seen in June, actually, Bloomberg did a big report covering Maduro's attempts to reach younger voters using social media and to sort of present himself as this sort of softer figure, more fun figure through these fun videos on TikTok. Is his strategy working? And what are the other new social media tools that are coming into play in this electoral round?
Actually, yes, we have documented how the Maduro government has been using tactics very similar as the other authoritarian countries in the region uses. They pay for people to tweet in favor of them. They also use institution resources to promote propaganda and disinformation, and they also create laws to restrict the online information to basically control or manipulate all the things they cannot directly control. For example, as you mentioned, TikTok. TikTok has become the second source of information for Venezuelans to get information about political things, but because of censorship. And TikTok has become this new platform to have access and to have popularity. The Maduro regime has been increasing the operations in this platform. We have since September 2023, we started the monitoring in the trending topics on TikTok too, and we saw that we never registered since September 23 to May 2024. We didn't register any political video on TikTok trending topics. However, since Maduro started increasing the campaign to against supposedly he was being banned. He said that he was being banned by the social media platforms. He increased the campaign. He reached out to the most popular content on TikTok since May 2024.
Wow.
This haven't has passed in the last months before, but all this operation started, as I mentioned, with the argument of Maduro being banned by platforms, although this is completely untrue. We have demonstrated that it's basically the opposite of that. But thing here is that somehow they are achieving to skip the TikTok algorithm that basically doesn't want the political content to be on the most important content on the platform. They prefer to entertainment content to be the main, let's say, the main conversation on the platform.
Mm.
But now on, Maduro has increased this tactic basically because TikTok discovered and suspended hundreds of accounts linked to the Venezuelan government. And after TikTok made the claim that they suspended in a report, transparency report, they said that they suspended this account. Maduro argument that he was being blocked and he was being banned by the platforms.
What you're saying is that one of the ways that they've kind of gamed the algorithm is by making fun videos that don't look like political videos. So it's basically, here, let me do a song and
Yeah,
dance. And then it's not a political video, and I'm getting around anything that would restrict political videos. Is that right?
correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
It's the direction they made for even on social media, even on TV, was to follow Maduro, to comment Maduro, and to give like to Maduro.
Mm,
It was like a military instruction to do this constantly.
hmm,
And after that, with the addition that the content is not confronting, it's not disinforming, it's just supposedly fun.
mm,
But in the end, it also portrays Maduro as efficient, close to the young generations, um, normalcy that we don't have in
mm,
Venezuela. This is new because TikTok, as I mentioned, is a second source nowadays for people to get informed in Venezuela of political information, but it's also that young generations we know use this platform a lot to connect with Venezuela. The ones in exile and the one inside use it also to disconnect from Venezuelan
mm,
issues.
mm.
So they are trying to pollute a new digital conversation.
I saw from research that Probox published in April from More Consulting. You mentioned that TikTok is the second largest source of domestic news. Instagram is the top. So 26% of people name Instagram as their top source. And I thought it was interesting. We'll make sure we link this in the podcast notes for people to look at this chart. Venezuelans in general are not getting their news from traditional news sources. They're really getting their news from social media and digital sources. How can these online tools also open doors for opposition figures and civil society?
One of the things we say a lot and we repeat a lot is not to underestimate the things you can achieve for civil society and for the critical voices through social media. Because of censorship, this has become one of the only available spaces for critical voices to communicate their narratives, their maybe their movement, decisions, even they don't have access to traditional media. So this is the only way they can communicate and they can connect with people online in the country and outside the country too. I think it's important to understand that we have more than 8 million people outside Venezuela in exile that doesn't have, for example, the opportunity to vote, but that doesn't mean they don't care. They care a lot, but that's the only way they can still feel useful for the cause.
Is there something that you're going to be looking for online on the day of the election?
Yes, one of the things that we are going to be monitoring is TikTok, especially because we know that the government has interest in this network and basically in promoting and portraying themselves as, as a democratic government in this network, and the use of the motherland ID to coerce people during the elections, to manipulate, to use this social mechanism control basically in favor of Maduro regimes.
Thank you so much. That was really great. It was wonderful to talk with you, Maria. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Karin Zasas. This episode was produced by Fabrizio Recalde. Luisa Lemmy is the executive producer. The song in this podcast is Nos volveremos a encontrar, performed by Venezuelan singer-songwriter Geraldyn García and cuatro player Daniel Molina for America Society. Check the podcast notes for a link to watch the full performance. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. Access other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast and send us feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check the podcast notes for relevant links about the Venezuelan election. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members.
Nos volveremos a encontrar.